Chapter 26, Madness. The Radio Tokyo men were back at Omori smiling. What a lovely voice Louis had. What a brilliant job he had done. How about another broadcast? As long as he wrote his own copy, Louis saw no reason to decline. He composed another message to his family, then rode with the producers to Tokyo. When he reached the studio, the producers announced a change of plans. They didn't need the message he'd written. They'd had one already. They handed Louis a sheet of paper. This is what it said, exactly as written. Well, believe it or not, I guess I'm one of the lucky guys, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm really unlucky. Anyway, here's me, Louis Zamperini, age 27, hometown Los Angeles, California. Good old United States of America speaking. What I mean by lucky is that I'm still alive and healthy, and yes, it's a funny thing. I've heard and also saw with one of my own eyes that I've washed up that it's reported I've died in combat. Yes, one of those who died gallantly fighting for the cause. I think the official report went something like this. First Lieutenant Louis S. Zamperini, holder of the National Interscholastic Mile record is listed as dead by the War Department. The former University of Southern California miler was reported missing in action in the South Pacific in May 1943. Well, what do you know? Boy, that's rich. Here I am, just as alive as I could be. But hell, I'm supposed to be dead. Yeah, and this reminds me of another fellow who was in the same boat as me, or at least he was. Anyway, he told me that he was officially reported as killed in action, but in reality was a prisoner of war. After several months, he received a letter from his wife in which she told him that she married again and thought she was dead. Of course, she was astonished to hear that he was safe and held in an internment camp. She, however, consolidated him by saying that she was willing to divorce again or marry him again once he gets home. Boy, I really feel sorry for that fellow like that. And the blame lies with the official who allows such unreliable reports. After all, at least they could do is let the folks back home know where their boys are. Anyway, that's not my worry, but I hope the folks back home are properly notified of the fact that I am alive and intend to stay alive. It's certainly a sad world when a fellow can't be allowed to live. I mean, when a fellow is killed off by a so-called official report, how about that? So that's the propaganda thing that the Japanese producers in Tokyo wanted him to read. It's not that bad. I actually would have read it because you hear what happens later on. Louis was aghast. He had long wondered why he'd been spared from execution at Kwachi after the 9 Marines had been killed, and why he'd been subjected to the will-weakening torment of Ofuna, yet not interrogated, even though everyone else had been. At last, the Japanese had made their intentions clear. On Kawajian, after Louis' execution had been ordered, an officer had persuaded his superiors to keep Louis alive to make him into a propaganda tool. A famous American Olympian, he'd reasoned, would be especially valuable. The Japanese had probably sent Louis to the crucible of Ofuna, then to Omori under the bird, to make his life in camp unbearable, so he'd be willing to do anything, even betray his country, to escape it. They had hidden him from the world, keeping his name off Red Cross rosters, and waited until his government had publicly declared his death before announcing that he was alive. In doing so, they hoped to embarrass America and undermine American soldiers' faith in their government. Oh, okay, maybe I wouldn't read it, I guess. Louis refused to read the statement. Still smiling, the producers asked him to join them on a little tour. They brought him to a cafeteria and served him a delicious American-style meal. Then took him to a private living area that had beds and mattresses and sheets. If Louis would make the broadcast, the producer said, he could live here and he never had to see Omori again. Finally, Louis was introduced to a group of men, Australians and Americans. These men, the producer said, were helping them make broadcasts. As Louis held out his hand, the propaganda prisoners dropped their eyes to the floor. Their faces said it all. If Louis agreed to make this broadcast, he would be forced into a life as his enemy's propagandist. Louis was taken back to the studio and urged to do the broadcast. He refused. The smiles evaporated, the faces hardened. The producers ordered him to do it. He said no. The producers left the room to meet in private. Louis was alone in the studio. In front of him were several copies of the message that they wanted him to deliver. He slid his hand through a tear in his pocket, snagged the copy, and pulled it in his coat. The producers returned. Okay, one of them said, I think you can go to punishment camp. Omori was called a punishment camp, but the producers were clearly referring to some other place. For Louis, any camp had to be better than Omori because the bird wouldn't be there. The producers gave him one last chance to change his mind. He did not. Louis was dumped back at Omori. The bird was waiting for him, glowing with renewed hatred. His beatings resumed with intensified vigor. Maybe Louis was being punished for refusing to make the broadcast, or maybe the producers to whom Louis had appealed for help had told the bird of Louis' accusations. Louis stood his ground, took his beatings with rebellion boiling in him, and waited to be shipped to punishment camp. And like all the other PNWs, he watched the sky, praying for the promise that the first B-29 will be fulfilled. In the early afternoon of Friday, November 24th, the two Tokyo sirens began to howl. From the sky came an immense shivering sound. The POWs looked up. There, so high that they appeared to be gleaming slits in the sky, were acres and acres of B-29s, 111 of them, flying toward an aircraft factory on the rim of the city. Caught in what would later be called the jet stream, the planes were streaking along at speeds approaching 445 miles per hour, almost 100 miles per hour faster than they were built to fly. The Americans had arrived. It was a cold, clear, sunny day, wrote POW John Arthur Jonathan, who was at a slave site at the time. The planes were shining like silver in the sunshine against the blue sky overhead. It was a beautiful sight which lifted our spirit right up to the sky. Men began yelling, "Drop the bombs," and "Happy landings," and "Welcome back." The guards stared up, so awed by the planes that they didn't seem to hear the men shouting. At Omori, the camp accountant, Yuji Hato, was standing with a group of POWs. As they watched, a lone Japanese fighter raced toward the planes, then abruptly, startlingly, flew straight into a bomber. The smaller plane shattered and rained down on Tokyo Bay. The bomber began falling, white smoke twirling from it. A single parachute puffed from its side, and one of the POWs cried, "One safe! One safe!" The English word caught in Hato's ear. He had heard it only used in baseball games. The bomber hit the water, killing all aboard. The lone survivor, under his parachute, wafted over Tokyo as gently as a dandelion seed. As the man sank to the city, Hato had a sick feeling, thinking of what would happen to the airman when he reached the ground. The other bombers flew on. A few minutes later, there was distant booming. That American soldier's like, his plane blows up and he's in a parachute. He's like, "Oh, so this is Tokyo," like about to hit the ground. No telling what's going to happen, right? As the fall stretched on, B-29s crossed over Omori nearly every day, sometimes a lone plane, sometimes vast continents of aircraft. On sunny days, the men stood out watching them. On cloudy days, they only heard them, a growl above the gray. In Tokyo, the sirens sang so incessantly that the POWs began sleeping through them. 81 bombers went on November 27th. On the drizzly night of November 29th to the 30th, the prisoners were awakened by two incendiary rains in Tokyo's industrial areas. Explosions were heard far away, and the POWs could see licks of fire on the mainland. The last gasps of 2,773 structures that burned that night. Civilians began streaming over the bridge and camping outside Omori's walls in hopes of escaping the bombs. One day that fall, Louis stood outside watching Japanese fighters turning lupine circles around a crowd of B-29s. The battle was so high that only the giant shining bombers were consistently visible. The fighters, tiny in contrast, flickered in and out of view as the sunlight caught them. Every little wink, there was a brief burst of light alongside the bombers. To Louis, it looked like firecrackers. It was the fighters gunned by the B-29s blowing up. The bombers flew on, imperious. The bird watched the scene with a stricken face. "Hikoki dami," he said. "Hikoki dami." Japanese planes, he was lamenting, were no good. Every B-29 that beat a path over Tokyo would wound the bird tighter. He hounded the POWs with endless inspections, prohibited smoking, singing, and card playing, and outlawed religious services. He slapped one officer across the face repeatedly for 5 minutes, made him stand at attention countless for 4 hours in the cold, then ordered him to clean the binjos for 2 hours a day for 2 weeks. He beat a kitchen worker with a spoon the size of an oar. He pawed through the men's belongings, confiscating personal papers and photographs of loved ones, deeming much of it as suspicious and destroying it. He was seized with paranoia. "You win war, you make all Japanese like black slaves." He shouted at POWs. He hauled Martindale to his office, accused him of plotting to burn down the barracks, and beat him so energetically with his fist and kendo stick that he overturned all the furniture. In December, the bird left camp for several days, and Omori was briefly peaceful. But on the night before the bird was slated to return, the POWs were jarred from their sleep to hear him charring through the camp in a driving rainstorm, yelling that it was a fire drill. When the designated firefighters assembled under the freezing downpour, the bird punched several of them in the face, ran through barracks shouting and punching other men, then ordered every man in the camp to line up outside. When Louis and the others did as told, the bird drew his sword, swung it around, and screamed orders and incentives, screamed orders and invectives. For 2 hours, the bird forced the men to pump water on imaginary fires, beat out phantom blazes with brooms, and run in and out of buildings rescuing food and documents. As December progressed, the bird's mania deepened. He rounded up the officers and hounded them across the bridge and into Tokyo on the pretense of retrieving firewood from bombed out houses. Trails of water for firefighting had been set along the street, and as the men marched, the bird leapt on, drew his sword, and screamed, "Kyrie!" The men saluted him, and the bird, lost in a fantasy, stood on his roost in an absurdly exaggerated, troop-reviewing pose that reminded Tom Wade of Mussolini. Civilians gathered and began cheering. After the POWs had passed, the bird jumped down, ran ahead, and hopped onto another trail, shouting, striking his post, and demanding salutes. Over and over he repeated the farce, driving the men on for miles. When the bombs were falling, the bird would snap, running through camp with his sword in the air, wailing at the men, foam flying from his mouth, lips peeled as he in a winked rictus, eyelid drooping, face purple. During at least two bombings, he prevented the POWs from seeking cover in the trenches. In one incident, he ran to the POWs outside, stood them at attention, and ordered the guards to aim their rifles at them. With bombs booming, the bird raced up and down the line, terrified POWs, swinging his sword right over their heads. Every escalation in the bombing brought a parallel escalation on the bird's attack on Louis. He sped around camp in search of the American, fuming and furious. Louis hid, but the bird always found him. 3 or 4 times a week, the bird launched himself at Louis in what Frank Tinker would call the death lunge, coming at him with fists flying, going for his face and head. Louis would emerge dazed and bleeding. He was more and more convinced that Guantanamo wouldn't stop until he was dead. Louis began to come apart. At night, the bird stalked his dreams, screeching, seething, his belt buckle flying at Louis' skull. In the dreams, the smothered rage in Louis would overwhelm him, and he'd find himself on top of the monster, his hands on the corporal's neck, strangling the life from him. As Louis suffered through December, some 300 miles away, his former pilot was wasting away in a filthy, heated barracks in the Zentutsi POW camp. Phil had been transferred to Zentutsi the previous August, joining one-legged Fred Garrett, who'd been transferred from Ofuna. Though Ofuna interrogators had spoken of Zentutsi as a plush reward, the camp was no such place. The prisoners' diet was so poor that the men wandered the compound ravenous, pulling up weeds and eating them. Their only drinking water came from a reservoir fed by runoff from rice paddies fertilized with human excrement, and to avoid dying of thirst, the POWs had to drink it, leaving 90% of them afflicted with dysentery. In one barracks room, men lost an average of 54 pounds over 18 months. An officer estimated that 20 men fainted each day. Almost everyone had Barrett-B, and some men went blind from malnutrition. On the last day in November, they buried an American who had starved to death. That's one of the worst ways to die, is to starve to death. There was one blessing at Zentutsi. Phil was permitted to send brief messages home on postcards. He wrote one after another. They were mailed, but got snarled in the postal system. The fall waned, and another Christmas approached, and Phil's family received none of them. A year and a half passed since Phil had disappeared. His family remained in limbo, having heard nothing about him since his plane had gone down. In November, they had learned about Louis' broadcast. The news had been tantalizing but frustrating. Louis had mentioned other servicemen who were with him, but the names had been obscured by the static, and the transcript hadn't conveyed with them with certainty. Had Louis mentioned Allen? On a Friday night in December 1944, the telephone rang in Kelsey, Philip's home. On the line was a major from the Johnson General Office of the War Department, probably through the Red Cross. The department had received news from Zentutsi. Allen was alive. Kelsey was jubilant. She asked the major to cable her husband and her son's fiancé, and in Washington, Ceci got the news, and she had waited for so long. The fortune teller had said that Allen would be found before Christmas. It was December 8th. Overcome with elation, Ceci called her brother to shout the news, quit her job, dashed through her apartment, throwing clothes and pictures of Allen into his suitcase, and hopped a plane back to Indiana to wait for her fiancé to come home. 4 days before Christmas, a card from Allen, written in October, finally reached home. Dear folk, hope you are all well, and I am looking forward to bringing home with you. I hope we can go rabbit hunting before the season closes, Dad. Give my love to Cece, Martha, and Dick. Happy birthday, Dad. Kelsey pored over the precious slip of paper, comforted by the familiar lines of her son's handwriting. Chaplain Phillips, now stationed in France, got the news on Christmas Eve. Words really cannot describe the way I feel, he wrote to his daughter. I am in an altogether new world now. I can think of nothing more wonderful. It is a real touch of all that heaven means. It is a real touch of all that heaven means. In a letter officially confirming that Allen was a POW, the Phillips were asked not to speak publicly about the fact that Allen had been discovered alive. Kelsey would henceforth heed the request, but the letter had reached her too late. By the morning after the War Department's call, the news was already all over town, and stories about Alan's survival were in the local papers. The Zamparinis, who had received a similar letter stating that the War Department now believed that Louis' broadcast had been real, were also asked to not speak of it publicly. The War Department didn't want it to known that it had erroneously declared 2 airmen dead, especially as the Japanese were exploiting the fact. Kelsey was allowed to send one cable to her son, and she filled the other days writing letters to him. On December 14th, she wrote to Luis Zamparini. As relieved as Kelsey was for Alan, there was heaviness in her heart. Of all the men on Green Hornet, only Louis and Alan had been found. Hugh Cupernell's mother was so demoralized that she could no longer bear to write to other mothers. Sadie Glassman, mother of the belly gunner Frank Glassman, had written to Louise asking if she had heard anything about Frank. Even though we had heard nothing, she wrote, the fact that you might know something makes us feel as though there might be a little hope. It is difficult to rejoice outwardly, things I do in my heart, when I think of the other mothers whom I have learned to love and realize how keenly they feel the loss that is theirs. Kelsey wrote to Louise, how my heart goes out to them, and I shall write them every one. As Christmas neared, Louis faltered. Starvation was consuming him. The occasional gifts from the thieves helped, but not enough. What was most maddening was the ample food that was so near. Twice that fall, Red Cross relief packages had been delivered for the POWs, but instead of distributing them, camp officials had hauled them into a storage to begin taking what they wanted from them. They made no effort to hide the stealing. We could see them throwing away unmistakable wrappers, carrying bowls of bulk cocoa and sugar between huts, and even trying to wash clothes with cakes of American cheese. The Bird was the worst offender, smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes and openly keeping Red Cross food in his room. From one delivery of 240 Red Cross boxes, the Bird stole 48, more than 500 pounds of goods. Toward the end of December, the Bird ordered all the men in the compound where they found a truck brimming with apples and oranges. In all of his time as a POW, Louis had seen only one piece of fruit, the tangerine that Sasaki had given them. The men were told that they could take 2 pieces each. As the famished men swarmed onto the pile, Japanese photographers circled, snapping photos. Then, just as the men were ready to devour the fruit, the order came to put it all back. The entire thing had been staged for propaganda. On Christmas Eve, some Red Cross packages were finally handed out. Louis wrote triumphantly in his diary. In his box, weighing some 11 pounds, contained corned beef, cheese, patties, salmon, butter, jam, chocolate, milk, prunes, and 4 packs of Chesterfields. All evening long, the men of Momori traded goods, smoked, and gorged themselves. Wow, that's great. They had a really great Christmas. Huh? That night there was another treat, and it came about as the result of a series of curious events. Among the POWs was a chronically unwashed, ingenious, and possibly insane kleptomaniac named Mansfield. Shortly before Christmas, Mansfield broke into the storehouse, slipping past 7 guards, and made off with several Red Cross packages which he buried under his barracks. Discovering his cache, guards locked him in a cell. Mansfield broke out, stole 16 more parcels, and snuck them back into the cell. He hid the contents of the package in a secret compartment he fashioned himself, marking the door with a message for other POWs. Food, help yourself, lift here. Caught again, he was tied to a tree in the snow without food or water, wearing only pajamas, and beaten. By one account, he was left there for 10 days. Late one night, when Louis was walking back from the Benjo, he saw the camp interpreter, Yukicho Kano, kneeling beside Mansfield, draping a blanket over him. The next morning, the blanket was gone, retrieved before the Bird could see it. Eventually, Mansfield was untied and taken to a civilian prison where he flourished. The one good consequence of this event was that in the storehouse, Mansfield had discovered a Red Cross theatrical trunk. He told other POWs about it, and this gave the men the idea of boosting morale by staging a Christmas play. They secured the Bird's approval by stroking his eagle, naming him Master of Ceremonies, and giving him a throne at the front of the theater, the bathhouse, outfitted with planks perched on the washtubs to serve as a stage. The men decided to put on a musical production of Cinderella, written with creative liberties by a British POW. Frank Tinker put his operating gifts to work as Prince Leander of Patenland. The fairy godmother was played by a mountainous Cockney Brit dressed in tutu and tights. Characters included Lady De Ray, Lady Gonorrhea. Louis thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Private Cano translated for the guards who sat in the back laughing and clapping. The Bird glorified in the limelight, and for that night, he let Louis and the others be. At Zenjutsu, Christmas came to Phil and Fred Garrett. Some POWs scrounged up musical instruments and assembled in the camp. Before 700 starving men, they played rousing music as the men sang along. They ended with the national anthems of England, Holland, and the United States. The Zenjutsu POWs stood together in tension and silence, thinking of home. After Christmas, the bird abruptly stopped attacking the POWs, even Louis. He paced about the camp, brooding. The men watched him and wondered what was going on. Several times that year, a dignitary named Prince Yoshimoto Tokushima had came to the camp. A prominent and influential man, reportedly a descendant of the first shogun from the Wu-Tang clan. Tokushima was touring camps for the Japanese Red Cross. At Omori, he met with POW Louis Bush, who was told about the bird's cruelty. The bird was suspicious. After Tokushima first visited, the bird forbade Bush from speaking to him again. When the prince returned, Bush defied the bird, who beat him savagely as soon as the prince left. Tokushima kept coming, and Bush kept meeting with him. The bird slugged and kicked Bush, but Bush refused to be cowed. Deeply troubled by what he heard, Tokushima went to the War Office and the Red Cross and pushed to have something done about Watanabe, the bird. He told Bush that he was encountering resistance. Then, just before the new year, the prince at last succeeded. The bird was ordered to leave Omori. Tokujima's victory was a hollow one. Officials made no effort to take the bird out of contact with POWs. They simply ordered